Switzerland, a country that conjures up images of majestic mountains, impeccable clocks, and unshakable peace. But did you know that this famous neutrality was not a brilliant strategic decision, but rather a series of events that literally placed it in the role of accidental neutrality? Imagine a world at war, pressures on all sides, and a country trying to survive among giants. In this video, we will discover how Switzerland, in the midst of chaos, built a legacy of neutrality that still fascinates the world today. Chapter 1. The day Switzerland chose not to choose it was the 19th century. Europe was a constantly fractious battlefield where alliances formed and dissolved with frightening speed. At the center of this turmoil was Switzerland, a small country surrounded by the continent's most influential powers. It was a scenario where survival was not guaranteed for the small, and Swiss neutrality was not even an idea yet. But everything changed in 1815 during the Congress of Vienna. After the Napoleonic Wars, the great European powers, including France, Austria, and Prussia, came together to redraw the continent's borders and restore political order. For Switzerland, this moment would be crucial. The country, known for its mercenary soldiers who fought for several European nations, was now in the sights of the great powers, but not for its strength, but for its strategic position. Switzerland's neutrality was formally declared in 1815, but here's the interesting part. This decision was not the result of an elaborate plan or strategic vision on the part of the Swiss. It was, in fact, an imposition by the great powers. They needed a buffer in the heart of Europe, a neutral territory that would serve as a barrier between historic enemies. At that moment, Switzerland accepted, not by genuine choice, but because refusing could mean its destruction. The Swiss were between a rock and a hard place. Either accept neutrality as their destiny, or risk being swept away by the forces of the great nations. The immediate impact. In the short term, the decision brought security to the country. With neutrality guaranteed by international treaties, Switzerland began to establish itself as a safe and reliable place, free from the disputes of its neighbors. But behind this apparent victory lay fundamental questions. How could a country survive being neutral in a world that seemed always at war? Chapter 2. The big problem, a divided and dangerous Europe. To understand why Switzerland's neutrality was so necessary, we need to go back to the European scenario of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Europe was a real pressure cooker, marked by historical rivalries, territorial disputes, and an arms race that would culminate in 2 world wars. Imagine living in a small country surrounded by giants such as Germany, France, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, all with expansionist ambitions. Switzerland's position in the heart of Europe was both a strategic advantage and a potential doom. Its mountainous territory could be used as a passage for troops, an invasion route, or even a strategic point for military supply. The central question: how to remain neutral on a continent where alliances were mandatory. This was the big question facing Switzerland. Neutrality was not an easy or simple choice, and its survival depended on a delicate balance. Refusing to ally with one power could be interpreted as hostility by another. On the other hand, accepting any alliance meant giving up its independence and being drawn into conflicts. External pressures. During the First World War, Switzerland found itself surrounded by countries engaged in a brutal war. The Central Powers, such as Germany and Austria-Hungary, viewed Swiss neutrality with suspicion, while the Allies expected the country to provide some form of logistical or strategic support. Nevertheless, Switzerland maintained its neutral stance, but not without costs. Internal pressures. While the world looked outward, Switzerland faced another challenge: maintaining its own internal cohesion. The country, divided by languages and cultures, German, French, and Italian, had to deal with the fact that its own citizens had conflicting sympathies. Many German-speaking Swiss favored Germany, while French-speaking Swiss leaned toward France. Maintaining internal balance was as important as avoiding external collapse. Survival came at a price. Being neutral often meant being isolated and mistrusted. Switzerland had to become extremely self-sufficient to survive, developing robust financial and banking systems that could sustain its economy without relying on external allies. It was during this period that the country began to build the reputation for security and stability that it maintains to this day. But this neutrality came at a moral cost. In later wars, especially World War II, Switzerland's role as a neutral country would be questioned. It would negotiate with both sides, maintaining its neutrality at any cost, even at the cost of controversial decisions. This neutrality was a shield, but also a prison. In the next chapter, we will explore how Switzerland managed to maintain this seemingly impossible position and how it shaped its identity over the centuries. Chapter 3. How Switzerland transformed neutrality into a pillar of identity. Neutrality, which was initially imposed as a necessity for survival, eventually became Switzerland's defining characteristic on the international stage. But this did not happen by chance. It took painstaking work to transform this delicate position into a strategic advantage and a symbol of national pride. Neutrality as an official policy. Swiss neutrality was not just a theoretical idea. It was institutionalized and widely disseminated as an official state policy. Switzerland began to reinforce its commitment to not getting involved in international conflicts regardless of external pressures. But how could this work in a world where wars were constant? Switzerland's answer was clear: invest in defense and diplomacy. Defense. Switzerland built one of the most organized and well-trained defense forces in the world, proportional to its size. The Swiss army developed a strategy that included transforming its mountainous territory into a virtually impenetrable fortress with hidden bunkers, tunnels, and artillery systems. Diplomacy. At the same time, the country worked hard to position itself as a reliable mediator. Switzerland offered its neutrality as a service to the world, hosting peace negotiations, international conferences, and organizations such as the Red Cross. Wartime neutrality. During World War II, Switzerland faced a critical test of its neutrality. Surrounded by both Axis and Allied powers, the country had to make difficult decisions to avoid invasion. Controversial dealings. Switzerland negotiated with both sides, providing banking services, materials, and even gold trading. While these actions protected the country, they also generated criticism, especially after the war, when questions arose about the role of Swiss banks in handling assets confiscated by totalitarian regimes. Military preparedness. Despite its limitations, Switzerland maintained a full mobilization of its armed forces throughout the conflict, sending a clear message: any invader would face fierce resistance. Neutrality as a hallmark. After the war, Switzerland managed not only to preserve its neutrality, but also to transform it into a hallmark. The country came to be seen as an oasis of peace, stability, and impartiality. This attracted international organizations, investors, and tourists, cementing the country's reputation as a model of security and independence. Over the decades, neutrality has gone from being merely a survival strategy to becoming an integral part of the Swiss identity. But for this to happen, Switzerland had to walk a fine line, balancing internal and external interests while reinforcing its commitment to peace. Chapter 4. Modern challenges to Swiss neutrality. As the world has become more globalized and interconnected, Swiss neutrality has faced new challenges. What once seemed like an ideal solution to avoid conflict has become an increasingly complex position to maintain. International pressures in the 21st century. With the emergence of economic and military blocs such as the European Union and NATO, Swiss neutrality has been put to the test. Although Switzerland chose not to join these blocs, the country could not completely ignore their impact on its foreign policy and economy. The European Union. Despite not being a member, Switzerland has entered into a number of bilateral agreements with the EU to ensure access to the European market. However, this has led to internal debates about the extent to which the country can truly remain independent while adhering to rules imposed by an external bloc. NATO and international security. Switzerland remains outside NATO, but participates in partnership programs such as the Partnership for Peace, which aim to promote security cooperation. This raises the question, how far does neutrality go when there is indirect cooperation on defense issues? Switzerland and global conflicts. In recent times, neutrality has been challenged by global conflicts, such as wars in the Middle East, Ukraine, and other parts of the world. As host of several international organizations, including the UN, Switzerland often finds itself in a position where it is called upon to mediate disputes or take diplomatic positions. Economic sanctions. Switzerland has been under pressure to adopt sanctions against countries considered to be violating human rights or destabilizing the global order. This puts the country in a delicate position. Imposing sanctions may be seen as a violation of its neutrality, but not enforcing them could damage its international image. Humanitarian crises. Switzerland also plays an active role in helping refugees and promoting humanitarian aid. However, this often means dealing with regimes or situations that may compromise its impartiality. The issue of cybersecurity. Another modern challenge to neutrality is the digital world. With cyber attacks and espionage on the rise, Switzerland has had to strengthen its technological defenses without compromising its neutral stance. This includes working with other countries to combat cybercrime while avoiding political alignments. The internal debate on neutrality. Internally, neutrality continues to be a topic of debate. While many Swiss see it as a non-negotiable pillar of national identity, others question whether it is still relevant in such an interconnected world. The young Swiss. A new, more globalized generation tends to question the limits of neutrality, especially on issues such as climate change, human rights, and global conflicts. The traditionalists. For them, neutrality is what has kept the country safe and prosperous for centuries, and any change in this policy would be risky. As the world moves forward, Switzerland faces the challenge of maintaining its relevance without compromising the principles that have defined it for centuries. In the next chapter, we will explore how Swiss neutrality not only shaped its history, but also inspired other nations and became an example of diplomatic strategy on the global stage. Chapter 5. The legacy of Swiss neutrality. The story of Swiss neutrality is more than a political strategy. It is an example of how a small country managed to stand out in a world dominated by superpowers. Switzerland transformed an initially defensive position into a hallmark of national identity that resonates to this day. Inspiration for other nations. While few countries have embraced neutrality as comprehensively as Switzerland, its approach has inspired policies and strategies around the world. Regional models. Countries such as Austria and Finland adopted policies of neutrality after World War II, seeking to avoid military alliances that could put them in direct conflict with major powers. Humanitarian diplomacy. Switzerland's role as a mediator in international conflicts has set a standard for other countries and organizations seeking to promote peace. Neutrality as a tool of soft power. Switzerland uses its neutrality as an effective form of soft power, influencing the world through non-military actions. International organizations. The headquarters of the Red Cross and many other global organizations in Geneva reinforces Switzerland's role as an epicenter of humanitarian diplomacy. Business and innovation. The political stability that comes with neutrality has attracted companies, banks, and investors, making the country one of the most prosperous in the world. The duality of neutrality. For all its benefits, neutrality also presents dilemmas. In times of global crisis, many expect Switzerland to take a firmer stance on ethical issues such as human rights and military aggression. This creates a tension between preserving neutrality and moral responsibility in an increasingly interconnected world. Future opportunities. Swiss neutrality will continue to be a model of independence and pragmatism. However, the country will need to adapt to global changes, balancing tradition and innovation. Swiss neutrality is not just a historical accident, but a deliberate choice that has shaped the country for centuries. More than just a foreign policy, it has become part of the soul of the nation, an example of how diplomacy and independence can be powerful tools in a world full of conflict. Today, Switzerland remains a beacon of stability, showing the world that sometimes strength lies in staying out of the fray, but deeply engaged in the search for peaceful solutions. Did you know that Switzerland has had to face countless challenges to build this image of neutrality, and that it continues to adjust its strategy in an ever-changing world? Leave your thoughts in the comments and share this video with someone who is interested in history and international politics. And don't forget, if you want to explore more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos.